All right, welcome back, everybody. Rejoining me for another war update live stream is our good friend Rain Waters, host of the Afterburn podcast. And as you guys know, he has his own YouTube channel as well. I'll put the link in the episode description for how you can subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. Rain is joining us. So remember, last time he was in South Korea. Today he is in Paris. So he's a world traveler, a real bon vivant. Rain, how are you doing?
Doing good. Good to see you again, Ward. It's been a minute, a couple days.
It has. So as we predicted, we're going to be doing these on a regular and persistent basis as events dictate. And, since the last one, in fact, since the one I did with Sal a couple of days ago, a lot has happened. So that was this one. We were talking about the mines and the Strait of Hormuz and so forth and so on. And at the time, it was sort of quiet. And then no sooner did I hit end stream and the episode went live, then a bunch of stuff happened in rapid succession. And Sal actually did another episode that day. So it started with this Thai container ship got hit very close to the Strait of Hormuz. And then at the north end of the Persian Gulf, two ships got hit very close to Iraq. You can see it's pretty devastating fire up there in their port facility, which I've flown over thousands of times doing Southern Watch. And then subsequent to that, this port of Shalala in Oman got hit. So as we're carrying out strikes in accordance with the war plan, the Iranians are responding with sort of an asymmetric counter resources, counter civilian, counter cultural targets kind of a thing, which we predicted they would. So that'll factor into our macro discussion here today. So meanwhile, in other news, the USS Gerald R. Ford in the Red Sea had a fire in the laundry spaces, and about 20 sailors treated for smoke inhalation. Two were worse off than the rest, but we understand from the Pentagon presser this morning that everybody's returned to duty. So that's another sort of situation aboard Ford. You can imagine that they are at their end of their sort of endurance. Of course, they're ready to do what they got to do, but we've asked a lot of the Ford on this deployment. And as we talked about in the last live stream, Bush will be relieving Ford. They'll do a turnover here in the next couple of weeks. So anyway, that happened aboard Ford. In other headlines, it's reported that Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the previous supreme leader, is reportedly in a coma, and he apparently lost a leg in that airstrike that killed his dad. I also, Rain, have seen a report that he's already dead. So not sure what to believe there, but certainly he is dead man walking in terms of the target list. Meanwhile, oil sanctions have been removed to attempt to help reduce the price of gas that is skyrocketing. NBC reports the United States has temporarily lifted sanctions on Russian oil, a boost to the Kremlin as Washington tries to contain energy prices that were sent soaring by the American-Israeli assault on Iran. President Vladimir Putin's team welcomed the move. And here's a tweet by one of their information ministers, Carroll Dmitriev: buy Russian oil and gas to maintain a balanced energy supply. The decision caused dismay in Europe, where officials feared it would give a timely boost to Moscow's war machine on their doorstep as attention shifts from Ukraine to the Middle East. This announcement failed to immediately calm oil prices, which have spiraled since Tehran effectively closed the vital Strait of Hormuz oil choke point. And we'll talk about to what degree that is true. This was a big talking point, a source of tension in the Pentagon presser this morning. And they also, as we just showed, began attacking energy facilities across neighboring Gulf countries. Meanwhile, the Republican Guard claimed they struck for the dozenth or so time the USS Abraham Lincoln in the North Arabian Sea. Navy reports they targeted an approaching threat first with 5-inch guns from one of the Arleigh Burke destroyer escorts, and then with Hellfire missiles fired from an H-60 helicopter. No word on what actually happened as a result of that activity. There's been nothing documented by a CENTCOM press statement or by Lincoln on any of their socials. So some goings on there, but sort of a ruminant at this point. Meanwhile, one of our main topics for this live stream, CENTCOM made the following announcement. All crew members of a United States KC-135 were lost in Iraq, confirmed deceased. All 6 crew members aboard a U.S. KC-135 refueling aircraft that went down in western Iraq are now confirmed deceased. The aircraft was lost while flying over friendly airspace March 12th during Operation Epic Fury. The circumstances of the incident are under investigation. However, and this is a big talking point between us today, loss of the aircraft was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. The identities of the service members are being withheld until 24 hours after next of kin have been notified. So last night when this was first announced, Rain, you and I were texting back and forth. A lot of bad intel, let's just say, floating around the various Bubba networks and also around X particularly about what happened here. So if you take the CENTCOM statement at face value, it didn't involve any surface-to-air missiles. And so that, if that is true, then that leads to, okay, what was going on there? One of the things that has been floated is that they were doing consolidation like this. This is, obviously a KC-10 behind a KC-135. But they were consolidating between 2 KC-135s. So what happens at the end of a cycle, let's say the offgoing or one of the offgoing tankers, because they have a lot of tankers airborne at any given time, the bucket brigade that gets, these TAC air in and out of Iran from wherever their base is in the western part of the Middle East. So let's say the offgoing says, hey, I got, and I'm making these numbers up, 100,000 pounds of give that I don't want to take home. Go to the other guy, can you take it? And he's like, yes, I'll take it. So we'll consolidate. So one of the theories is that's what was going on. And that's when the midair occurred. Another theory that I've seen is that they had a head-on midair where the one aircraft that exploded and was lost hit the vertical stab of the other airplane. What we know happened to the other airplane that landed at Ben Gurion in Israel. You can see that red circle around the vertical stab. It's sheared off just above the American flag decal. So it's probably the wrong term to use, but this is very lucky for this crew in that respect. Here's a closer view of that. Folks on X were quick to point out that just because it says Beale doesn't mean it was manned by the guard members, the air guard members assigned to that unit. So we'll be mindful of that. So Rain, your thoughts when you heard about this first, when we were talking about it last night?
I mean, first, obviously, my thoughts and prayers are with the families. We have 6 families today that are getting the absolute worst news of their entire lives, and a whole friend set there. I still have a lot of friends that fly this, so my immediate thing is kind of going through the people I still know flying and then trying to make sense of what happened here. Like you alluded to, the CENTCOM message said there is no surface to air missile that threatened it. There was no hostile fire or friendly fire. And then the pictures started coming out. So, that's when I've witnessed the force extend once in my lifetime between a KC-135 and a KC-10. It's something awe-inspiring to see these two massive airplanes refueling one another. So now you're kind of thinking that, did something go wrong while refueling? Was there potentially something on the ground? Was there a threat that was called out, something that spooked and got to move? Was there turbulence? Or, looking at the pictures, it doesn't look like that vertical stab was crushed. It looks like it was sheared off. Did it somehow pass and obviously inflict so much damage on the other aircraft where that one obviously was not recoverable? But this is a dynamic thing that we do thousands of times each month, right? Between fighters and tankers, heavies and tankers. And a lot can go wrong, but a lot of training goes into prevent it. But, again, the perfect BB coming through, going through the Swiss cheese model there, and then the accident happens here. So, there's a lot to dissect, and then trying not to speculate too much, because I did talk about this yesterday. The Navy's probably very similar. Right now, the Air Force is going through the Safety Investigation Board. They're standing that up. And it's a 30-day process when there's no extenuating circumstances in a conflict zone. That's probably going to get extended out a little bit. Once that concludes, that's when the Accident Investigation Board starts. It looks very similar to the Safety Board, but Safety Board is privileged. So we think attorney-client privilege. It's only going to be for Air Force aviators specifically to this, and for need to know. The Accident Investigation Board, that's the one that the public will see in a year or so.
So nothing we speculate on here or surmise is to get ahead of that process, which is sacrosanct and something that we've participated in, and we honor completely. So as you can see from this footage here, and that's an AWACS, that's not another KC-135, but still basically the Boeing 707 airframe. It's a fairly, I'll use the word docile evolution, although I'm sure those guys are killing snakes in the cockpit, but it's not as dynamic as when you would tank or my guy in the front seat of the Tomcat would tank. A reminder that Air Force tanking is 180 out from Navy tanking. So what we're seeing here is drogue into receptacle at the top of the airplane. The boomer in the airplane he's actually flying the boom. We used to tell him to lock the boom so they wouldn't attempt to fly it. But this is a fairly controlled evolution, as you can see here. Slow closure. His job is to get the light logic that's on the bottom of the fuselage where it's supposed to be, whatever that looks like. Rain, green lights. I've done it in DCS. I've never done it in real life. But you just put the airplane where the light logic is right on the bottom of the airplane, and they plug into you, right?
Correct. And you have to remember, too, the KC-135 was really designed the same time with the B-52, being able to do that strategic nuclear mission. Obviously, we've kept the KC-135 around for 70 plus years, and now refueling fighters, all sorts of different platforms. But those lights, the guidance lights that you're looking at, they're designed based on the length of a B-52. You still work. There's some tricks, and some are dim, some are better than the others. But I am curious. 707, that AWACS we just saw refueling, just like another KC-135, that's going to be the receptacle is going to be in the same spot, I would imagine. But those lights, maybe they're easier to see, maybe they're not. I don't know, but it is something to consider. Also, too, while you do mention it's docile, the difference from a fighter aircraft with a very responsive throttle, if something's going wrong, I can really quickly bump the jet out of the way. It's going to automatically disconnect. or I can force the disconnect really quickly. But in a a tanker or a big plane like this, it's just not going to be as responsive, obviously.
So the tail of the tape, roughly 62 KC-135s are stationed at airfields controlled by CENTCOM or at Diego Garcia to directly support Epic Fury. Additional 36 are positioned at bases in Southern Europe and the Med to support aircraft transiting to the region. Sluggo, our good friend and former KC-135 pilot, points out there are only 8 of those that are air-to-air refuelable. So that narrows the Bureau numbers down to 8 that would have been involved in this, assuming that's what happened. Again, we don't even know if they were doing this. I'm calling it consolidation. What did you call it when they're tanking each other?
That force extend.
Force extend. We don't know that that's what was going on here. And last night when we were going back and forth, we were thinking it was something other than that. So let's chat a bit about our experiences in contingency ops with tanker tracks. So tanker tracks are well established. Each tanker has a geolocation of a 10-mile leg racetrack, nominally maybe longer legs, separated geographically and also by altitude, right? So you got to read the ATO and make sure you're tanking off the right tanker. Many times you're like, okay, our tanker's there at 24,000. We're here at 22,000, right? Let's go over there, kind of a thing. When you're doing this wall of metal air ops, like is happening now, 8,000 targets being hit a day. So that's hundreds of sorties on the ATO a day. I will probably never be able to see the ATO, the air tasking order, because it's top secret. But Rain, can you imagine the eye chart that thing is?
No, and that's we've talked about I'm doing those Operation Midnight Hammer podcasts, and just for that one, offloading the most gas in the history of the last 25 years of conflicts, right? So this has to be on such a scale and magnitude with the number of aircraft, the number of tankers involved. Obviously, open source, all the spotters are tracking the amount of iron that's moving to the region. And just like you said, all those target sets that are being hit, there is a lot of iron that is up in the skies. So you can imagine this is, from a command and control standpoint, there's a lot of moving pieces that are happening here.
And so the other thing is you read the ATO, and we'll talk about weaponeering when we talk about our next subject on today's live stream. But first thing you find out is, okay, what type of tanker? Because to us, that mattered a lot. So if you got a KC-10, you're like, oh, perfect. Big pillow with that drogue. It was really nice. Take up reel. If you got a 135, there were more 135s than KC-10s in theater during Operation Southern Watch, the no-fly zone over southern Iraq. It was that adapter on the back of the Air Force probe that was just basically a rubber hose it didn't have any take-up reel. So when you first got into theater, it was pretty hairy. And I, as a senior RIO, generally flew with junior pilots. So I would be with them the first time we hit that baby and ripped off a lot of probe tips, some probe doors. It was pretty hairy, especially at night, right? So, but you got good at it. So you're reading the ATO. What type of tanker? Then, okay, what tanker track? And you better get the details right. And then you launch, and just like always, the plan has changed. Like we're saying, if they're doing this force extend, it's because it didn't go as planned. So I don't know if they come up in the clear or somehow transmit it. I don't know these days how you get information, but they're like, okay, you're no longer on, and I'm making these labels up, but you're no longer on Exxon 5 at track Strawberry. You're now at Shell 54 over on Grape, right? And that's how that would go. And then you got to look and go, okay, what altitude generally it'll be Zorching around at what, 300 knots, 350 knots, pretty fast. So we're kind of up near the mill stops when we're tanking, and they're pretty high too. So this is all to say it's inherently chaotic, and this isn't dropping bombs on bad guys. This is getting gas. This is getting to and from the objective. So as we said last time with Sal, these guys are doing 8.5-hour missions. I'm not talking about the tanker guys. They're probably doing longer missions than that, probably 10-hour missions. TAC Air, Viper, Wild Weasel, Strike Eagles, Super Hornets, Growlers, 8.5-hour missions. And again, as a TAC Air guy, that's a long time to sit in an ejection seat, right? So that's an Endurex. And, mistakes can happen, right? So this is day, 12, 13 of the war?
Yep, day 13, I think.
The bench isn't deep. Right now, these are the same guys since they mobilized 30 days ago who are doing these missions day in and day out. We need to be mindful of that. Yes, best ever, nobody can do what we do. All true, but they are human beings that, have a limit in terms of endurance. And so some of this that we're, not to get ahead of the investigation, but some of this could be a function of that. Fires in laundry rooms, function of that. So I want the audience to be mindful of what we're asking of our men and women who are downrange. So our first guess, Rain, was this event, the midair was not that they were doing consolidation, force extending. We thought that somebody came out of their altitude or, other tanker tracks. The other element I will throw in here, which is from a unofficial, I will underline unofficial, but credible source. And we'll talk about all the mitigators here. And we're not going to do conspiracy theory, but we have it on credible account that there was a SAM fired over Western Iraq. Our understanding is that there was also comms on the radio where the KC-135 said, SAM, SAM. And then the midair happened. So you've seen nothing. In fact, you've seen denials from CENTCOM that this was a function of hostile or friendly fire. And I've been trying to run this to full ground. Again, the source of this information is credible, but not official. And I'll just leave it at that. So, Rain, if that's the case, that opens up a Pandora's box of the highest order.
It does. I do have some stuff that might be counter to that, where other people are not concerned about that. I'll just leave it at that, but I think it's maybe not the case. However, you and I, we kind of war gamed this out beforehand. There's a couple different things. One, if I was Iran and I could get one of these mobile surface air missile systems out, I mean, they had them, they have them. We don't know if we've got them all. If you could get it into an area where you thought you were not worried about it, and then you were able to threaten an aircraft, obviously that creates a big problem. And we haven't seen anything like that, but it was mentioned. And again, I'll say crazier things have happened. Again, I go back to that Midnight Hammer podcast. I know for a fact that the moon actually caused a threat reaction during that operation. So it's not too far-fetched that even if there wasn't a legitimate surface air missile launch or threat of a launch where this tanker was operating, given the elevated tension, the stress that's going on in that environment, I don't think it's too far of a leap that if an explosion happens, if something is shot into the air, maybe it is not a surface air missile, but it looks like it, that it injects additional chaos into this environment where SAM launches are being called out. Again, this is, we don't know that information, but I think in this environment, kind of all bets are off and you can't rule anything out.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Again, I'll bring up this here's a B-52, but let me roll it back to where it's the AWACS. So, look at this closure rate. The other thing to note, they're not on goggles, right? They only the spec ops version is on. Those guys are on goggles when they're down low, right?
Unless something has changed, there's only a certain number of KC-135 pilots that get checked out on NVGs, and those are usually supporting special operations. Now, it could have changed, but again, when we're refueling, we're not wearing goggles. Those goggles come up when you're hanging out on the wing. Unless it's just really dark, but those goggles come up. So there wouldn't be a need to be wearing NVGs. You have no depth perception when you're there. So I would not envision that's changed.
Okay. So the other thing, let's look at the airplane at Ben Gurion again. So, oops, that's not the right picture. Hold on. Here we go. So like you said, this doesn't look like this vertical stab jabbed into the fuselage, right? This isn't a downward crushing motion. This is sheared off pretty clean. Like, is it 1,000 knots of closure kind of clean? Or is it, left to right, glancing blow kind of clean? Again, I'm not a mishap investigator, but they will look at things like the way that the aluminum, the skin of the fuselage is peeled away. That tells you angle of incidence at impact. Whether it was left to right, right to left, fore and aft. You can see that one thing in front of the flag is peeled off. So, was this so again, let's imagine, for whatever reason, the other thing we didn't talk about, Rain, is, and you and I were talking about this morning, is things like vertigo, right? Your sight picture when you're flying form, so, you're just staring at the airplane at port observation, waiting for your turn to tank. He goes into a turn, and, you're doing IFR parade, which means you'll stay on his wing line. And again, you're seeing the same thing. Maybe you're feeling a little G in the turn, and then whatever. And then maybe you sneak a peek at your HUD and you're like, oh my God, that doesn't look anything like what I thought I was seeing. Right. And then your gyro just comes completely uncaged.
100%.
Right? And so it's the old trust your instruments thing. So was this a in and out of the goo, right? Clouds. We also were talking about, was it turbulence? It could just be a meteorological phenomenon. But it's obviously not normal for them to have this kind of a collision. So there had to be something that was a mitigating circumstance. Obviously, the most dramatic would be a SAM. And if it's a SAM, because the other thing about this statement, and let me just bring that up again real quick, that however, the loss of the aircraft was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. So we're all snake bit by the Kuwait shoot down that we were talking about, and you did an episode, and I did an episode about, right? The friendly fire episode. So is this, Iraqis that are manning a Patriot battery that are jihadists, or are they just clueless? I know back in the day, I was as scared of our cruiser in the strike group when I was returning to force as I was Iraqi SAMs, because they would light us up. We're like, stop it. It's us. We're on the RTF profile. I got mode 4. Knock it off. And right. So, and as we've discussed, there is a history of blue on blue with Patriots and so forth. So is it that, or if you want to get really sort of, tier 1 conspiracy, are the Russians manning bleeding edge S-400 sites fresh off the factory in just-in-time supply chain to the Iranians? And what's our max for that kind of a shot? Again, they were over Western Iraq. First word I got was it was Eastern Iraq, but it was not. It was Western Iraq. So that's another stretch. So
Yeah. And
So
as
again,
we
we'll
sit here,
find out.
when we sit here and talk about it too, a couple different things. Seeing that shear, it looks like the tail is sheared. So something obviously injected the chaos to cause this. Was it turbulence? Was it deconfliction issues? Were they doing force extend and they had something? If they were doing a force extend, this aircraft, assuming this would be the one getting the gas down low, if they have some kind of burble, if they have some kind of threat reaction, I would envision that just by pushing and dipping away, going to idle, you're going to have that separation versus because this looks like, again, if you had some kind of conflict deconfliction issue and these two made a close pass, the fact that it would just, the golden BB of just hitting this tail and hitting a critical component on the other aircraft where it was unrecoverable and not just a massive fireball is just wild. You just wouldn't expect these two big pieces of metal, but we've seen big sky theory. The other piece with the SAM is I would lean more towards if there was something on the ground that was perceived to be a SAM that causes, I could buy it. But if we actually had an S-400, you got two massive pieces of metal in the sky, big juicy targets. Basically, you can't miss. So if you're going to take a shot, you're going to hit them. You would think like KC-135 is not going to be able to outmaneuver an S-400 shot. It's not going to be in the cards. But
okay, to that point, they do train. The gun school has a heavy evasive maneuver training syllabus, and so how do I know this? Because Sluggo was an instructor there, and so what that does it look like the Glib 2 we used to do against SA2? I don't know. What is the move, right? So real or perceived, it's the same outcome.
Absolutely.
As you're saying, So I think you put it perfectly. Tensions are high, and so you're plugged in. The responsibility of the co-pilot is scan the ground, right? As I'm flying here, station keeping while we're consolidating, getting our give, I want you to look outside, right? And the boomer too. So he's looking out. I don't know what the viz is downward from the ass end of the airplane, but anybody who's got a portal, 6 guys in the airplane. So pilot, co-pilot, boomer. You had what else? You got a crew chief. Do you have a navigator for this type of a mission?
No navigator, but they had 6 crew members on board. So maybe, additional boom operators, additional pilot, some kind of additional complement.
Yeah, maybe because long duration hop, you got to have cycle guys in and out to those, because really there's only 3 crucial positions: pilot, co-pilot, pilot, and boomer. So yeah, maybe extra guys to load share, but everybody's looking out at the ground that has access to a window or whatever, right? And so again, did we see a plume? Did we see something? And then you react to something that in real life wasn't there. Is it turbulence? What I'm thinking on the turbulence front, Rain, is if it's so bad that you can't plug, then you're probably going, look, we're not going to consolidate. Just go home. You go. I'll forego whatever the balance of you were going to give me, and I'll just, do what as fragged in the ATO, right? So the weather piece is one thing. The other thing about weather, if it's not turbulence, the going in and out of the clouds, the goo, many times I've been plugged in, and all of a sudden you're what we call walks off, right? And sometimes to a prohibitive degree, you can't even see the knuckle on the KC-135, right? So you just hold what you got, and if you can't gut it out, hope you break out, then you just pull the throttle back and just disconnect. And then everybody takes a 30-degree turn away, and you do not attempt to rejoin until you're in the clear, right? So that could be the situation. But when you look at that footage of them tanking, the extreme maneuver that would have had to happen, assuming it was 135 tanking 135. Either somebody went aft and sheared off the tail, like you're saying. Did he go idle out of nowhere and this guy underruns him, right?
Yeah.
Or did he pitch up and drag the nose through the tail like this? Again, we're completely surmising here. Whatever, the crew that landed at Ben Gurion was immediately put in separate rooms and they had to write a statement. Right.
Yeah,
Before they landed, the head of the aircraft mishap board was assigned. It's probably the XO of one of the other squadrons there at Ben Gurion. Generally, it'll be, not the CO, but the XO, not of the same command. And his board is assembled. You got an 04, 03s, and you're off and running. You get a lawyer. We'll talk about JAGs in a second. And then you have 30 days to have the initial reports on the street. So everything we're hypothesizing here is known to the people that it matters. So if in fact it was a SAM, then they're at the KAOC rejiggering the target list for these pop-up SAM sites in Iraq, if that's the situation. Or you got State Department going to the government and going, hey, get a grip on your jihadists here shooting at us. Again, I'm not saying that's what happened, but if it is what happened, then we're attending to it already. But let's imagine that isn't the case, but it was just something else that we're talking about: weather, vertigo, loss of situational awareness, kind of a thing. So the other thing to note is, because I've had a lot of people ask me, don't they have parachutes on those airplanes? And the answer is they did until 2008. And then because of the cost of not just the equipment, but also the para-riggers in the facilities to keep those parachutes packed and inspected and all the other stuff you got to do, they decided the risk wasn't worth the expense. So, and we have no idea if that would have been survivable had they had parachutes, but terrible circumstance. First report was 4 were found, and they were looking for the other 2. I think we all sort of suspected that nobody could survive that. And now 6 casualties, as you said at the outset, rightfully so. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families and the squadron mates. This is the worst. If you've ever lost a squadron mate, lost an airplane, it's beyond gut wrenching, and you sort of have to really sack up to continue the war. And these guys can't rest. The squadron mates are out there as we speak on the tanker tracks, refueling airplanes that are going in country. As the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War briefed today, this is the highest number of sorties, the most bombs we've dropped so far today. So the war isn't getting any easier. So let's be mindful of the fallen as we marvel, rightfully so, at the capability of our military. So we'll stand by for. Oh, go ahead, Ray.
I'll say you make a good point there, and you mentioned it briefly in the beginning, where a lot of these tanker crews, the war is not letting up. They have to continue. Unfortunately, we lost one of my squadron mates in my last deployment, and we stood down for 2 days before we started flying again. Other squadrons picked up the load to continue on. But you mentioned, just because that said Beal on the tail doesn't necessarily mean it's Beal crews. A lot of what happens in the tanker force, they even do blended crews. So you might be borrowing an aircraft tail from Beal, and then those 6 individuals on that plane could be from 6 different squadrons, guard, reserve, and active duty units. So they typically mix up. So it might not just be 2 squadrons that are impacted here. You could have, a handful of squadrons that had crew members on this plane that are scattered across the AOR. They're scattered across the United States and the globe, for that matter, that all have friends and squadron mates who perish in this, that have to keep pressing on.
Good point. Roger that. So again, let's keep our thoughts with the folks in harm's way, thoughts with the families of the fallen. So we'll update everybody if we hear anything I'm going to set expectations to say that nothing will be transmitted officially for some time, up to a year before there's an official report as to what happened here. Now, Rumint will continue. We'll hear things through the Bubba network, the same thing that we heard last night in terms of this idea that there was a SAM in the air. Because I'm not just saying that because I want to dabble in conspiracies. This comes from a unofficial but credible source. But again, there's been no acknowledgement from CENTCOM. And so we'll wait to hear about that. All right, next topic, Rain. So on the first day of the war, a girls' school in southern Iran was hit by a TLAM. So this school was adjacent to a IRGC Navy compound. So you can see this is the Sajara Tayyibeh Primary School in Minab, Iran. Minab is located, let me find my map here. Here we go. So you can see Bandar Abbas here to the left. That's where a major naval installation is. And then over here where the pin is dropped is where the school is. So here's some BDA before and after. So there's in May of 2024. And then you can see March 4th, which is 5 days after this strike, as well as all of the buildings in the compound. The girls' school there to the north is also hit. Here's an image that purports to show parts of a TLAM. Officials have accepted that those are in fact TLAM parts, but they do not leave out the idea that these fragments were put there from somewhere else. But be that as it may, there is the parts of the TLAM. Let's talk TLAM for a second, and then we'll talk about targeting. So we're up to block 4/5 version of the TLAM. The TLAM has been around since 1983. Tomahawk land attack missile. GPS guidance. I won't read you the slide, but you can see all of the different parts of it. Note there on the speed, it is subsonic. And that matters in terms of how this might have happened. It has about a nominal 1,000 mile range. Can be shot from submarines, surface ships, or aircraft. This is obviously a B-52 that it's coming out of. So let me roll this back. Here's amateur video of that TLAM hitting. And there's a slow-mo following that. You can see here very slow. And I froze the screen there. Hits. And this is a pretty small warhead for some of the shots I've seen. Of course, the questions arose to the White House and the Pentagon. Hey, what happened? Did we do it, or did whomever? Here was the president's, let me bring this up, first statement on the girls' school.
The United States bomb a girls' elementary school in southern Iran on the first day of the war and kill 175 people?
In my opinion, based on what I've seen, that was done by Iran.
Is that true, Mr. Hegseth? It was Iran who did that?
We're certainly investigating.
Still investigating.
But the only side that targets civilians is Iran.
We think it was done. We think it was done by Iran.
Can you give us an
Because
idea?
they're very inaccurate, as you know, with their munitions. they have no accuracy whatsoever. It was done by Iran.
So now at the briefing today, both the secretary and the chairman acknowledged that it looks like it was an American missile. The press corps asked follow-on questions, and the secretary basically said, look, it's under investigation. That's all we're going to say about it. So obviously targeting or hitting civilians with collateral damage is not something we want. As Secretary Hegseth pointed out, we don't intentionally target civilians. The Iranians do, and they have, obviously, by what they've been shooting at since this war started. But as you can see in this here, if you're targeting all of the dimpies there in the compound, and you also, the other thing that came out, Rain, is this was dated information. What do they call it? The exact word they used, outdated rather, information, which is amazing to me. That was kind of a weird thing for to hear. So your thoughts about this whole circumstance?
It's tragic, and I think it's absolutely true. The U.S. doesn't target civilians. Like, this is the last thing anyone wants. Now, what we have seen, right, over 6,000, 8,000 targets have been hit. So we talked about a couple episodes ago, the JPITL, the Joint Prioritized Target List. This is a massive list. It has to be, just absolutely massive for this operation. I would love to see the comparison scale-wise to some of the previous operations, but I imagine it literally has to be, it's just much larger. We've also seen, the battle with the Department of War, Anthropic, and now articles are coming out, reports are coming out about how AI was utilized to help build some of these target sets, which would make sense just given how large it is. So when we look at all of this, the data, bad data in is going to result in bad outcomes. So how often is this data refreshed? Did it mistakenly get put in there? Did the school change? Like, these are some of the, did it become a school in the last year or two, or whenever the data was collected? Was it just a mistake? When was it, when it was being reviewed and put on the JPITL? All these things, because I know you can attest, just like when it comes to strike planning, looking for potential civilian population centers or where civilians might be adjacent to a target set, that is absolutely first and foremost. But again, we're talking at this scale, there's a lot of data to go through, a lot of targets to go through. And again, you're relying upon satellite imagery. All these buildings start to look the same, I would imagine, when you're looking at this scale and volume. I don't know, what are your thoughts around it?
I think I agree with everything you said. In terms of the targeting process, as we said, when it gets to our level, as the guys who are going to deliver the weapons, there aren't any JAGs involved. Our assumption is this is a legitimate target, and then it's up to us to weaponeer it based on what we're told about what is the structure. Is it reinforced concrete? Is it buried under earth? This will determine fusing and all of that sort of thing. So that's what we do at our level. We also, they give you a heads up, and this is sometimes why you pick, in my case, a Tomcat over a Hornet back in the day, because our display was gigantic and high res, and they were looking at the little, fuzzy thing behind the stick. So it's like, it is a communications tower between a mosque and a soccer field, right? So you got to limit the explosion. You can also, based on the fusing, what's going to blow out which direction. We can do all of that at our level. Okay, so that's part A. Now, that's not TLAM. TLAM is not a manned weapon, right? So the thing, let me bring up this graphic again. Okay, like I said, subsonic. So when I look at this video of the TLAM hitting, and I'll freeze it when it gets to the slow-mo. Okay, so that angle of incidence, that angle of impact seems high to me. Okay, so I'm just stick with me here. So a subsonic weapon can get hit by small arms fire on the way in and go stupid. Right? That's one possibility.
When I saw that angle, that was the first thing that popped my mind. You know, when you see the TLAMs, when there's video, right, flying low altitude over Iraq into country, when you're dropping 500-pound and 2,000-pound class weapons to maximize effects, minimize collateral damage, you're typically trying to give that ordnance the most energy possible. So dropping it as close to the target as fast as possible to give it that steep, you know, if I can get an 89-degree angle, it's going to minimize the chances of missing, collateral damage, etc. I've never seen a TLAM, you know, not that that vast experience with TLAMs with that steep angle of impact. And maybe that's a normal thing, but I think it is odd to me to see that steep angle.
Yeah. So investigation ongoing, that sort of detail would come out in the investigation, but maybe it was just bad intel and it was intentionally targeted. That's, you know, it sounds trite to say tragic. 167 children killed and an additional 10 or so staff of the school. That's not how we want to conduct war. And if you do that intentionally, as many retired aviators who've been on the news have said, you don't do that because that makes more enemies than it dissuades enemies. You know, that's not the way that we're going to do business here. But it's unsat all the same. And if we're going to assume the high ground, we cannot allow that to happen. As General Kane briefed, we have hit 10,000 targets to date, and we're on a 1,000 target per day clip. So the ATO process, the JPITL process, where JAGs fit in that selection of legitimate and illegitimate targets is crucial to avoiding this again in the future. And so let me also play another little snippet here from Secretary Hegseth and his ongoing, let's just call it war on the JAG Corps. And we'll talk about what that means on the backside of this.
Out the woke distractions, slash the red tape, and put every asset back into winning wars. But one area still needs a hard reset, and that's how we do legal support in this department. For too long, over 20 years, legal shops across the services have grown bloated, duplicative. They've muddied lines of authority and pulled critical judge advocates away from what matters most, advising commanders in the fight, on operations, in deployed environments where seconds and minutes count. And that's unacceptable. In a great power competition or with any threat that we face, commanders need agile, independent, dead-on legal advice that enables decisive action, not endless process or turf wars. They need JAGs focused on warfighting, military justice, operational law, law of armed conflict, deployed contracting, intel law, cyberspace, you name it. Everything that sharpens the edge in large-scale combat. But right now, military lawyers are sometimes stuck doing civilian side work that belongs to general counsels instead. And that drains readiness and leaves gaps where we can't afford to have them. And that's why today I'm directing the service secretaries, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, through their general counsels and JAGs and the SGA to the Commandant, to execute a ruthless, no excuses review. Scrub it clean, cut duplication and bureaucracy, clarify roles and reporting, no more moral ambiguity. Align functions so that military legal stays laser focused on warfighting and readiness.
So remember, one of his first acts after he fired the chairman, the CNO, assistant, or the vice chief of the Air Force and some others, was to fire every head of the JAG Corps in Navy, Army, and Air Force. I think those were the three that he nailed. So he's sort of, setting the tone. And so on his face, I don't have any quarrel with anything he said there, right? My experience with JAGs is as pedestrian as I'm going on deployment. I need a power of attorney. Lieutenant Watson, please help me with that. And he'd come to the ready room and he'd brief us on wills and that sort of thing. I was the legal officer for my first squadron for VF-32. I went to the legal school in Newport for 6 weeks after my first deployment and dealt with the base JAG a bunch. So that's probably the administrivia that Secretary Hegseth is talking about there. Necessary because those guys would advise me and my CO if it went from non-judicial punishment to court-martial. That's when you roll that guy in and he's got to help. So this is good order and discipline. You've got to have that part of it. Now, in terms of targeting and war fighting, I never saw a JAG. Did you?
No, not when doing like a deliberate strike. Like that's already all vetted. I could see a time-sensitive target that pops up, and at the KOC, you're going to have a JAG who's on the floor advising the commander and reviewing, making sure. But from a operator standpoint, you're not going to interact. You're not going to interface other than before I leave, I got to make sure my will is updated.
Right. And so above our node at the unit level, there, and like you say, KOC, JSOC, or the JTF, whatever, there is a JAG, and he's probably at least an 06. He may be higher than that, and he's got a team. And so they are vetting targets at their level. And then it goes down to the LNOs and they write the ATO and then it's pushed to us. So there are JAGs in the mix, and their bias matters on the margins to avoid these sort of mistakes. So again, I have no quarrel with what Secretary Hegseth said in that little video. Let's just say I have concerns of what the resonant effects of the judgment of the JAG Corps might be going forward. Because the subtext is, hey, you guys, don't do any of your woke moral ambiguity, right? So what's the definition of moral ambiguity when it comes to knife in the teeth war fighting?
Yeah. And again, with this one, I think it's I imagine it's probably two separate things, right? We're dealing with here. I go back to, 10,000 targets, 1,000 targets a day. That's like the sheer volume of review that's required. And again, if it's bad data that goes into the JAG to review because it's outdated intelligence, something has changed. Again, they're just looking at the target sets and yep, that's an IRGC compound and they produce X, Y, and Z. It all looks legitimate. It gets the rubber stamp of approval. Again, because the TLAM obviously there's a lot of planning that goes into utilizing TLAMs.
And we're talking about the weaponeering process at the unit level and how granular it can be, but bombs fuse early. They don't fuse. They, again, a fin breaks off and it's not guidable anymore. This is not clean business. This thing called projecting power and dropping munitions on a foreign country. We don't target civilians, but if you're striking headquarters and communications and the local radio station or TV station in Tehran, there are civilians all around. And you've seen the amateur video of things blowing up and you're like, there's no way you can control where all of that shrapnel, where all of that wreckage goes after the bomb hits. Somebody wandering by, you don't know who's there, it's shift change, whatever. So there will be civilian casualties. It's not what's intended, but it is inevitable. And that, President said as much on Air Force One. He asked the Washington Post reporter to admit it. He's like, wouldn't you say this is part of war? And the guy actually kind of reluctantly, he's like, I wish you wouldn't ask me that, but yeah, of course. And so, there you go. The other thing that came up in this conversation is the Civilian Harm Mitigation Office, which I did not know existed, was doged. So all the employees who work there were laid off, and it was doged under the header of it was redundant to the inherent planning process. So I can't comment on whether that was true or not, but I'll just note that there's been some action around the idea that that office was eliminated under the Doge, clean sweep, and as a function of that, perhaps we're not making some a step in the matrix was removed. The last item here, Rain, is I know this matters to you in your drill capacity, but there's been some discussion about reinstituting the draft. I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. My dad fought in Vietnam. And then when I was in middle school, the older brothers of my friends got draft cards. Some of them went to Canada. So what I will say about the existence of a draft in terms of the culture is suddenly apathetic people have a political outlook. So all of a sudden, everybody has an opinion about the war, either pro or con. That's a forcing function like we've never experienced since Vietnam. Further, what the draft was during Vietnam was sort of like a race war and a culture war. So rich kids went to college, the elites got excuses, bone spurs, you name it. And then middle class and lower class went to the war. And that was not like everybody's going to serve and do their time. That created great resentment. The protest movement was intensified by the existence of the draft. So this is just being thrown out there. So maybe we'll have to start the draft. Ironically, a guy who dodged the draft or didn't get drafted because of bone spurs is articulating that, not a political statement, just a fact. So what are your thoughts about the idea that there could be a draft going forward?
Obviously, my opinions don't represent the Department of War or anything like that, but I think we're a long way away. Like, is that really the need? What's the problem set? Do we need more bodies? It doesn't seem like that's the case right now. And two, when it comes to the draft, just in general, I think, fortunately, we will never see another conflict like we saw with World War II or Vietnam, where it's just massive bodies. There are a lot of problem sets that you've already touched on a little bit that come with the draft. People who didn't care about what was going on all of a sudden have automatic skin in the game because they have a number and they're waiting to see if their number gets called. There are just problems in general with the draft. If we look at society as a whole, there's just not enough qualified bodies to meet the full demand if the flag went up based on what is required by law to deliver to the Department of War, Department of Defense, if that happens. But I think when we see this, it's obviously very dramatic. There's a lot of stuff going on right now. And currently, is bodies what we need? I don't think more bodies is what we need to try and win this conflict, in this conflict, however you want to phrase it and look at it. What do you think?
I think it depends how it goes, right? I think the conflict as being executed now, the answer is no. But this is the problem when you do that first step off the line of departure, creates entropy that you can't control. So the White House has listed some end states, right? Eliminate their nuclear ability, regime, if not change, at least somebody that's more pro-Western. That, again, President Trump has said he wants to help pick that guy. Navy neutralized, which we think is almost done, but still we have tankers getting hit by Navy things, whether they're unmanned or whatever. We do not believe any mines have been laid yet, nor will they, but there's still the ability for the IRGC to halt shipping with asymmetric activity. So you can't just pull out and then ignore that, so we're going to have to attend to that as going forward. So we've loosed things that are not a linear targeting proposition, right? So that's what concerns me. So I'm not saying boots in the ground, but if this goes high order to the degree where we've started peri-World War III, let's call it, then now manpower becomes an issue, as we're saying already. God bless the active duty force, the all-volunteer force that's downrange right now. They've been on deployment for 8-10 months. These are guys and girls who like to be little league coaches, church deacons, husbands and fathers, and they're out of pocket, right? And it's a zero-sum game. So somebody goes home, somebody comes back. We're not making the force bigger for the time being. If it requires bigger, then you realize your bench is not very deep. And so that's when you have to look at the idea of selective service. That's what happened in Vietnam, right? It was just, we needed people, and here's how we do it. It was a clunky process, an unfair process that massively divided the country. I, as what grade was I in? 5th grader. We drove into a protest in Washington, D.C. Our country squire station wagon surrounded by mounted police and radical hippies. And my dad, the Marine, was like, everybody keep your heads down. And luckily we got out of there. But, I was traumatized by it. So, this don't imagine that can't happen these days in the event that, we decide that that's the way we're going. So I concur with you. This is a next order consequence. This isn't in the cards in the near term, or let's just call it the status quo as the war is being executed now. But I'm not hearing a definitive off-ramp, because there's no way to surmise what it's going to be based on all the moving parts. We don't even know if the supreme leader is alive or not. Never mind whether we like that guy and could accept him as the supreme leader. Because I think the answer is no. He's a radical cleric, maybe worse than his dad, right? So what is that off-ramp? But I just think it's interesting that the D word was uttered by the commander-in-chief, and now it forces the nation, your mothers and fathers in the heartland, to consider that kid playing video games is 3 years removed from being draft eligible. What are your thoughts? Right? So I don't think it's unreasonable for parents to just sort of get involved and think about what's going on here and have an opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Just it being mentioned, right? Like, that's to the forefront. You need to think about this because it has real consequences.
Roger. All right. Well, Rain, we've had a good hour plus here. Great crowd. Haven't had a chance to look at the chat. But as always, when I hit end stream, you guys can come back and check out the chat. I will, sure. And then you can add comments like a normal episode. Be sure to check out Rain's channel, the Afterburn Podcast. Rain, as we say in France, au revoir.
I will see you next time.
Okay. Safe journey home, my friend.
Cheers. Thanks, Mooch.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again, big crowd, for the live stream. We'll continue these as events warrant, and they certainly have in recent days, and I don't imagine that's going to mitigate anytime soon. So if you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.